The 1950s. This is a decade that was shaped by the decade prior. During the 1940s, there was America's involvement in World War II. And with that came the mass deployment of American men to join the army, fight for their country. That left the workplace primarily female, because all of the others were off fighting in war. These women had to work in factory jobs, producing weaponry. That's where we have the radium girls and things of that matter that were women exposed to high levels of radiation in supply chain style production lines. But with the end of World War II and the coming of the Cold War alongside the baby boom, the world changed very, very rapidly, especially for a woman and her newfound independence. Not only were 3.8 million children born into one of the largest generations in American history, the baby boom, but this brought a resurgence of what was widely considered family values that had been damaged by World War II. It was quite simple and almost expected what happened. When men were returning from the war, they found that their jobs that they had held prior to being drafted into the army were now being occupied by women. And as we know, especially in matters of the workplace and honestly otherwise, men got priority over the women workers, who were then forced to retreat back to their homes. And as someone who had experienced independence, this transition was very hard for many women. And that gave the rise of propaganda, like numerous books that were published. There was this one titled Cooking is My Form of Poetry, and things along those lines that told women to return back to the nuclear family that they had lost and to be subservient to their husbands and to live out their life properly. Something that came with the baby boom, as is to be expected, influx of children, and then government subsidizing for ex-military mortgages. So those who were drafted in World War II could now have more free reign over actually owning a home, gave rise to the suburbs. The suburbs that would later shape America into what it would become. And conveniently, the suburbs that reinforced the women stereotypes that really were typical of the era. Something that many of us can relate to, especially in the time that we're currently experiencing, online school pandemic. The nation was very much concerned with returning to a state of normalcy. Normalcy, which meant all of this was occurring. People, in a way, just wanted peace. But interestingly, though many women were forced out of their jobs and were now required to be solely mothers, there was still a much larger percentage of women in the workplace post-war than there was pre-war. And many attribute this to the later sexual revolution of the 1960s. Revolution. Interestingly, through my research on the topic, I found a number of articles that attribute the widespread adaptation of cars to the point where every suburban household would have one, in direct correlation to the rise of premarital sex in teenagers. Simply enough, many women sought to keep their jobs, but there was a sort of, as there always is in such a fervently capitalist society, a class differentiation where it was considered a poor reflection on a woman's husband if she had to keep a job So the majority of women who were in the workplace were of that lower class who needed the second job of the mother to sustain the family income. Simply enough, this was a conservative's worst nightmare, from what I'm seeing, because during this time period of war, devastation in Europe, which in some ways never really truly reached the American lines, except for that altercation in Alaska, which the Americans quickly handled. But the people back home, it was a full dismantling of all family values, because now these women were empowered, premarital sex, more of the family values were changing very rapidly. And obviously there was many people who opposed it. But the 1950s was really just a turning point for all of these things. And you could see the beginnings of revolution for women and also for the minorities, who incredibly could have been expected to fight alongside American soldiers and risk their life for their country just to come back and not be treated as equals or even human in some extreme scenarios. So I think in summary, this war quickly opened the eyes of the minorities, the women, the people of color, to how life could be, how they weren't ill-suited to be independent, they were fully capable of it, and that they deserved to be treated equally. And then back came the soldiers, and they were expected to return to a life before they had experienced this independence. I think something that is very important to be mentioned is the groups that were most victimized by this shift. So as I was saying previously, it was a lower class that really had women have to work, and as such they were excluded from this idealization of domesticity. And as one can imagine, the group that was most affected by this, due to both systemic factors instilled prior to the war and even in times of segregation, which, was something that truly never left people's perception. The African American woman was by far the most targeted and victimized group of people during this time period, for they didn't fit the ideals of the nuclear family, as the majority of them were in low-paying jobs. As a result, both of their skin tone and otherwise racial prejudice that would not let them exceed this low-class view of themselves. So it seems that the 1950s was a good time if you were white and rich enough to, stay back home, have your wife make you a martini, and write poetry in her pies. But I think something that I have really taken away from this time period is that it served as the stepping stone for the future that we currently have now, which is imperfect in many ways, but much closer to the world that these women and these people of color would have wanted to live in this time period. So I feel like in some ways we've exceeded their expectations, but looking at it with a modern perspective, there's still so much we can do to seal the wage gap between both race and gender. But I think all of that protesting more liberal free love era is to come. Okay.